So, why don't we begin this journey by talking about Ravel's life and how it came to him to compose the work Tzigane? Well, Ravel was born on March 7th, 1875, in the Basque village of Ciboure, which is close to Spain. Even though he was brought up in Paris, Ravel always felt very close to his Basque heritage. His father, Pierre Joseph, who was an engineer and an amateur pianist, sent him to his first piano teacher for lessons at the age of 7. At this age, Ravel was easily distracted, so his mother, Marie, resorted to bribing him for each hour of practicing completed. He entered the Paris Conservatory in 1889 and won first prize in the 1891 piano competition. But he failed to win any more prizes, so he ended up being dismissed from the conservatory in 1895. He returned as a composer in 1897, and though he produced works like the Violin Sonata, he did not win any prizes and so was dismissed from the composition class in 1900. Despite this, he remained as an auditor in the class of Fauré until he left the conservatory in 1903. Now, Ravel had a very uneasy relationship with authority and found it difficult to conform. Despite his obvious desire to succeed, he failed 5 times between 1900 and 1905 to win the Prix de Rome. But in spite of all these failures, when Debussy died in 1918, Ravel was considered France's leading composer. This led to his being offered the Légion d'honneur in 1920, but he publicly refused it. Ravel's newfound status, though, had the result of alienating him from some of his colleagues, in particular Satie, Cocteau, and Lessis. The outbreak of World War I had a profound effect on Ravel as he believed that he had a duty to serve his country, even though he was classified as unfit for military service. Despite this, he managed to secure a job as a driver in the Motor Transport Corps, but he became very ill and returned to Paris, only to find his mother on her deathbed. After his mother's death in 1917, Ravel fell into a deep depression. All of this sets the stage for the work Tzigane, which was completed in 1924. The inspiration for the piece came in 1922 while Ravel was attending a private musical soirée. After having heard his sonata for violin and cello performed that evening by the Hungarian violinist Gély de Rogny and cellist Hans Kindler, he asked de Rogny to play some gypsy tunes. He was so intrigued with the exotic melodies that he heard that he asked her to continue playing, apparently until 5 o'clock in the morning. And so, from that encounter, Tzigane was born. Not long after that, he called on his friend and neighbor Hélène Jourdain Morange for advice about writing for the violin. He asked her to come over quickly and bring the Paganini Caprices for reference. It was not until the spring of 1924 that Ravel wrote to de Rogny with more specific plans. He said that the Tzigane must be a piece of great virtuosity, which it has certainly turned out to be. Tzigane was originally scored for violin and luthial, an electronic device which had a sound similar to a harpsichord. It was completed only 2 days before the first performance. Ravel was present at the premiere, which took place in London on April 26, 1924, with, of course, de Rogny performing. There probably were revisions after this performance, as the score is dated April to May 1924. He then created the orchestral version of the work, and de Rogny performed it with the Cologne Orchestra on November 30th, 1924, with Pierre conducting. Now, Tzigane begins dramatically with the violin alone, playing slowly in a long introduction, or what we call the cadenza portion of the work, ending with trills and double stops which are played with the harp. It then becomes very rhythmic, punctuated here and there by pauses and occasional interludes. Towards the close of the piece, the tempo moves faster and faster and then finishes with three chords at the end. Now, Ravel had mixed reactions to the early performances of the work, but these performances turned out to be huge successes. His colleagues and critics, however, were not at all kind to the piece. In a letter to Poulenc, a young composer wrote, "Last night I went to the Ravel Festival to hear Tzigane, which is quite the most artificial thing Ravel has ever put his name to. It is poor, very unexciting indeed. The principles that motivate those pages are so out of date that I'm astonished anyone can still believe in them." So says the young composer. Now, another critic wrote, "One is puzzled to understand where Ravel is at. Either the work is a parody of the Liszt by Brahms' Joachim School of Hungarian violin music, or it is an attempt to get away from the limited sphere of his previous compositions to infuse into his work a little of the warm-blooded needs." However, Herbert Ancliffe writes, "He has gone right to the origin of all good music, to the traditional tunes and feelings of the people who care nothing for artifice and convention." In 1935, despite resting and traveling to Spain and Morocco, Ravel's health deteriorated to a point that he was sometimes unable even to sign his name. He was suffering from Pick's atrophy, a rare disease that causes the destruction of nerve cells in the brain. A few letters reveal his frustration at being incapable of putting on paper the music he had in his head. Ravel died in Paris on the 28th of December 1937, 9 days after having had a brain operation. He was buried in the cemetery of Levallois-Perret, a Parisian suburb, in the presence of composers Stravinsky, Poulenc, Milhaud, Berkeley, and other distinguished musicians. So now that we've learned a bit about the life of Ravel and how Tzigane came into existence, why don't we continue the journey and discuss ways to realize and interpret the work? But first of all, we need to establish an overall point of view on the performance of this piece, which is called Tzigane. As Susan Baer wrote in the virtuoso violin works of Maurice Ravel, she says he was insistent that every indication he wrote into his music be followed literally. This says a lot about the kind of liberty we really have in the performance of this piece, even if it is written as a Tzigane, which is a gypsy piece. Going even further, his close friend and violinist Hélène Jourdan-Morange said, "I have never known a composer so sure of himself with regard to the markings in his music." So, what does that tell us? Well, I believe that what all of this means is that we simply should play what he wrote. And with that thought, let's dive even deeper into Tzigane. Well, to start with, Ravel writes lento quasi cadenza at the beginning of Tzigane. Simple enough, but quasi cadenza? What exactly does he mean by that? Well, let's see, what do we already know? Cadenza is basically a place where we display our skills, where time is not so strict. So why did he write cadenza? Why did he write quasi-cadenza? Well, within this ambiguity lies Tzigane. And we can take it this way or that. I guess it just depends on your point of view. Well, from my point of view, what this means is to play over the bar lines, almost as if they didn't exist. Yeah, older people than me might say, play the larger phrase without regard to those bar lines. And for me, therein lies the meaning to quasi in this introduction. So I believe that it's really important to observe the difference between 32nd notes and 16th notes in the opening, especially of Tzigane. For example, in measure 1, 32nd notes. More 32nd notes. Again, 32nd. 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 Until we come to measure 4, we finally get a 16. Measure 5. Now, I mean, there is a noticeable difference in character between doing a 32nd and. So, one really must pay attention to this when playing the 32nd notes and the 16th notes in Tzigane. When working on the music of Ravel, I believe it is extremely important to observe details such as this, such as even the duration of notes, and observing particularly the rests that he writes, as this helps us to understand the timing that Ravel had in mind, particularly with Tzigane. For example, observing the length of the half note tied to the eighth in measure 1 is important. 2, 3, 4. We need to have an understanding of that length, that duration of that note. 2, 3, 4. It sets in motion the atmosphere that Ravel had in mind. Now, some of you might have seen, or might even do, the opening not up bow, but down bow, as this is certainly a part of the Hungarian tradition. But he specifically wrote an up bow, so I believe up bow it should be. You see, Ravel wrote Tzigane in the style of a gypsy player. So it would stand to reason that one must play what he wrote to realize that style, and not to make the piece a gypsy-like, or play it like a gypsy by shortening note values, or disregarding accents, etc. You see, he's already made it a gypsy piece. It's written into the piece, in fact. From measure 9, the marking changes to tempo rubato, which is written above the staff, with espressivo written below the staff. I guess this truly lays to rest any idea of doing a rubato or being gypsy-like with the tempo in the beginning, as he didn't write these words there. Looking at the passage going from 16th notes to a sextuplet of 16ths in in measures 9 and 10 offer us the possibility to experiment with pacings. Pacings mean how you shape, how you use time, because of his use of the words tempo rubato and espressivo. So we're looking at the passage. Now, we can do all kinds of stuff with this. That's one way. Take another way at it. Because he wrote rubato, there are so many possible ways we could interpret that, including that accelerando. I mean, he's given us an idea that we can actually exploit and go with because we have a bit of freedom with rubato and espressivo. Now in measure 14, we go up on the G string like this. Coming down to an extension for the first harmonic, and then pulling the fourth finger back for a normal sort of fingered harmonic. Yeah, one is the fifth, one is the fourth. So when you put it together, it sounds like that. From measure 15, we get a theme with the espressivo marking again below the staff, but without the indication of tempo rubato. Do notice that he indicates where he wants his slides to be done, because we're going back and forth between F and B flat. It's sort of hard to do when you're on the G string without sliding. Well, he writes no slide between the F and the B flat, but he writes a slur. Huh. So we have to finesse with our bow so that we don't make a slide. Because right after that, he writes from the B flat the line for a slide with even an accent. So we've got when I look ahead though, he doesn't do it again with the same material. No accent. His attention to detail is clearly in evidence. In measure 25, we find that very high E, D sharp E. Well, my fingers are just too big to do 3, 2, 3. I can do it, but I can't do it very quickly. So I bend the 3. Pull my finger back. And it means I can now do much quicker. Not only are there ascending slides as in measures 15 and 16, but in measure 27, he notates a huge descending slide from the high G to the C on the G string. We get there. There we are. So we're going all the way down from that high G to the C on the G string. Now, from measure 28, we stop the G string section, as was indicated with the sign in the beginning of the instructions. You see that sign. It stops on the D. So for measure 29, we begin the next part in this evolution of Tzigane, that being the opening theme in octaves. To execute these octaves, I think there are only two possible ways of fingering them. At least those are two that I'm aware of. The first would simply be the use of 4-1 fingering for fourth finger normal octaves. Sort of like that. The second way, however, would be to introduce fingered octaves into the fray. Fingered octaves are done, unlike normal octaves, which are 4-1, 3-1, well, they're done with alternating fingerings, such as 3-1 to 4-2. To perform fingered octaves, there's quite a stretch. Going really stretching. Well, unless you have huge hands, you probably really want to stretch backwards from here to here and not forward from here to here, simply because it hurts. It stretches quite a bit to go from 1 to 3 or from 2 to 4. Much more comfortable to go from 4 or from 3 back. That way, we can end up doing with a little bit more speed and a little bit more clarity. Oh yes, do notice that the opening statement was marked forte. And now from measure 29, it's marked fortissimo. I mean, this does have an effect on how we think of the opening statement. Now let's take a look at the sixths, which follow in measures 34 and 36. The use of the fingering 2-1 and 4-3 clearly help us to play the passage cleanly. So, that helps. Or in measure 36. Do notice that I did 2-1, 2-0 for the open. We can do it quicker, like that. For measure 37, Ravel references an earlier motive from measures 9 and 10, but this time with octaves. And as you can see, there are lots of Ds. Well, do you remember what I was talking about in measure 9? Well, here we go. Do you remember what I was talking about in measure 9? Well, here we go. Well, do you remember measures 9 and 10? You know the... Do you remember measures 9 and 10? You know... Well, here we go. Same thing, but this time, we've got lots and lots of Ds. 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 passage, which sort of looks like it's straight out of Tzigane with another one, another one. Do you remember the passage from Tzigane? Well, this passage ends up with an A at the top with a note with a dot on it, which isn't a part of that trill. It's not attached to the trill note. Immediately afterwards, there's a passage which mixes natural and artificial harmonics. The artificial ones, or fingered ones, are played like this. And the natural ones is just like that. Put together, they sound like this. You can really fool around with it. Now, up to now, we've had octaves and sixths. So for measure 42, he brings thirds into the picture. Oh, do notice he puts in the slide. He writes it in. But in measure 44, he doesn't put one in. I swear, he really, really, really is very detailed, very committed to his notation. Well, my only problem, I don't particularly like that sound, much prefer, I guess because I can vibrate it more, I don't know, but it means I have to cheat a little bit. I mask it just a little bit with my right hand, but certainly it doesn't sound anything like the one that he marked. And oh yes, we must notice that he wrote the word espressivo under all of this. With the key change in measure 46, molto espressivo portando is now written above the staff, which is generally a place reserved for tempo references. Well, portando or portamento is like a sliding between the notes, sort of like this. We're being slinky about it, sliding all around the place. I do find it curious that he wrote molto espressivo portando above the line, which is generally reserved for tempo, but I don't know, maybe he didn't really want us to be too strict. Now we must look at what happens in measures 49 and 53 with trills in sixths. Well, actually, it's a fifth and a sixth. 4 and 53. This gives us a hint of what will become a very big passage later on in the piece. He uses this technique with the harp for a very interesting effect. So, in measure 50, we get our first left hand pizz passage. So, to do this, you have to be sure you catch the pizzicato in the direction, like in the direction of the bow. We're pulling it. I've got, here, let me show it to you closer. So I hope that helps to give you an idea of the direction one is pulling one's finger. Now, this passage has the bow. And what we want to try to do with the bow is to make it sound like the pits as much as we possibly can. Now in measure 54, we have our first double harmonics, which are played like this. A natural harmonic and a 1/4. He even puts natural harmonics before it, 1, then 2, and then cute effect. From measure 55 to measure 58, we have an extended sixths passage, which in fact is sort of a mirror of what happened in bars 46 and 7. You remember the now we have it's really sort of similar, you know. With at the end of it, of course, all on the G string. Remember measure 53 when I said it would come back? Remember this? Well, now we're dealing with a big passage of a fifth. It sort of rambles around. Sort of like that. In the orchestral score, this is played with the harp, doing lots of arpeggios going up and down. And so, mysteriously though, we end up and we keep going until we end up with A major. From measure 68, the quasi-cadenza has officially ended. So everything from here on is accompanied in a new key. In measure 76, we get the main theme, which becomes very rhythmical. Do notice that I'm doing these all down bow because this is what he wrote. And then we get to the next one. And guess what? It's all on an up bow. So he writes in down bow and up bow. Ravel is a very clever and truly meticulous composer. So from rehearsal number 7, or measure 91, we have a mix of natural harmonics, an open string, and a plucked open string. Here, let me show you how it's done. So we've got natural harmonic, first one on the A string, then one on the D, slurred, with the one on the D going to an open A. So we have, and it goes back to a pits with the left hand. From rehearsal number 8, or measure 104, there's a variation on this theme which mixes a note with a grace note two natural harmonics slurred. So we've got a grace note. Oh, he does write un poco più moderato. Guess he heard that it wasn't easy to do this. So we've got the grace note and another, and it keeps going through. And oh, do notice that the theme is apart. It's hidden in this passage of grace notes and harmonics. From the pickup to measure 120 or rehearsal number 9, we now have a melody which is marked espressivo, but the marking is beneath the staff, so clearly it's an expressive marking. Yeah, I don't like the idea of doing the same thing twice. So, on the E string, I go to the A string. And then the calisthenics begin with a down and up or arpeggio, pits, and keeps going like that until we get to this descending passage, which ends in a trill. And as we've come down, now we go back up. And we go up first with a chromatic scale, followed by notes under a slur with dots, which would normally mean, but in this case, I think what he's referring to is a ricochet boy. To do that ricochet bowing, it's simply letting your bow bounce, coordinating that with, yes, he did write a diminuendo. So from rehearsal number 11 or measure 134, we have a full-blown variation of left-hand pits and right-hand pits. So what we do is we start with the right hand, left, right, left. Oh, now he writes a slur over the right hand pits. Just a note, never do it across. Always do it diagonally. It'll go cleaner, more evenly, faster. So we've got, and then the whole passage is like that. So in measure 165, just before the rehearsal number 14, we have 3-note pizzicato chords. Do note, the harmonics afterwards are quarter notes. These are eighths. So obviously, sort of like a written in ritardando. And now we get a passage of harmonics, natural harmonics. The theme again, remember? Well, he does the theme once, and in the middle of this, I like to do the following. I like to take it to fingered harmonics because it's the same notes. Because of that, I can slide. Then I go back to the natural harmonics that are written. From rehearsal number 15, or measures 184 to 191, we sort of do a high-level French hoedown. I'm reminded of this because I grew up in the South. I grew up in Nashville, Tennessee. And so playing country music, but check it out. Here's what Ravel wrote. It sort of resembles a hoedown. Sort of. And then suddenly from measure 192, or rehearsal number 16, we are thrown into a world, again, of trills. This time, basically it's all up here. Well, I do it crossing over from the E string some like to go down. I guess I don't trust myself to hit the notes very cleanly, so I do it across. Your choice. From rehearsal number 17, or measure 202, we change keys again. This section marks the arrival of another theme, marked Meno Vivo and Grandioso. And we get these sort of flourishes with pits. Oh, and just before it, there's a huge slide. Very dramatic. And here from rehearsal number 20, or measure 227, begins what you might call the final theme, which is a passage with 2 notes slurred and 2 notes separate. Now, a couple of ways to do the separate notes. Either you can start from the string, sort of a collé, or take your bow up. I tend to like the version that's closer to the collé. Oh, and do notice that in measure 235, there are 6 notes. For this one, we drop our bow in that kind of a rotation. That gives us now from rehearsal number 21, or measure 237, we have a variation of what came before with 2 notes slurred and 2 notes separate. Do you remember? But this time, the second of the slurred notes, or the second note, is a natural harmonic. And then the 2 notes. And for measure 241, we have the alternating bow and left-hand pits again, with a huge sweep going all the way across. And the pits is slurred, ending with a left-hand pits. And let's not forget the marking esitando. In case you didn't know, it means hesitating or balking or faltering. Sort of, in other words, not straight. Anyway, to get across the string crossings and do all of that, you'd have a hard time playing it straight anyway. Remember the passage starting in 227? Well, this passage from measure 245, or rehearsal number 22, resembles it. It's like a variation. Remember the two notes slur with the two notes separate. Then in measure 250, the vivo, he uses a pattern with 3 fingers. We've got C sharp and A, G and E, and we keep going up in half steps. Until we get to A major. A major. So are we finished with this variation yet? No. As we now, you remember the one I'm talking about, because now we get it with a fifth, sixth, sixth, fifth. And now in measure 263 through measure 269, we have natural and artificial or fingered harmonics again. So, natural, fingered, natural, natural. And this pattern continues, ending with 3 natural harmonics slurred. And then in measure 269, he reverts to something we saw in measure 244, that being the pits that are slurred. Even writes out not what. And then in the end of the measure, he actually does with an up-bow pitch. I guess this sounds different than that. Oh, you know what it is? He wanted to hear the beat first, so that we really hear. Now from measure 273, we begin our push to the end, starting with a gigantic cascading chord on the piano, ending up in a sort of Gilbert and Sullivan slow march. Sort of reminds me of the blues movement in the second sonata. So what does the violin do with this? Well, from 266 to 281, it's all on the G string. Wow. To give it a little spice, I like to do it up-bow. Some people have even taken to doing it sul ponticello. So from here to the end, things are sort of built in stages. And there are moments such as in measures 284 and 294 that we seem to start all over again. Then finally, after a lot of hesitation, we get to measure 322, which starts the race to the end of the piece, where we end with these 3 pizzicato chords. You will hear this excursion into Tzigane when you listen to my recording with the pianist, the wonderful pianist, Elizabeth Schlesinger. You'll also be able to follow along looking at my edition, which is found on VirtualSheetMusic.com.